I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as the world reacts to Russia's cluster munition strike on civilians in Sumy yesterday, we assess whether Donald Trump's opinion that it was just a mistake will let Vladimir Putin get away with it. And we hear from our Berlin correspondent on the latest, potentially pivotal political developments in Germany.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 14th of April, 3 years and 50 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our executive editor for audio, Francis Dearnley, and our Berlin correspondent, James Rothwell. But first, the latest military and political developments in Ukraine, starting in Sumy. We're going to start with the news as usual, but we're going to focus initially on yesterday's strike in Sumy. President Zelensky has urged Donald Trump to visit Ukraine to better understand the devastation wrought by Russia's war in the wake of yesterday's strike on the city that's killed 34 people and injured over 100. President Zelensky, speaking in an interview broadcast on US network CBS yesterday, said, please, before any kind of decisions, any kind of forms of negotiations, come to see people, civilians, warriors, hospitals, churches, children destroyed or dead. Now, there were two strikes yesterday, a short period of time in between the two missiles. Most casualties appear to have been caused by the second strike as people gathered to try to help victims of the first. The strikes used cluster munitions. That's according to the outgoing US ambassador to Ukraine, Bridget Brink, speaking yesterday. And earlier today, Ukraine's military intelligence, the HUR, said the Russian 112th and 448th missile brigades were responsible for the attack. They say they used 2 Iskander-M ballistic missiles. General Kirill Bodanov, the head of the HUR, said on Telegraph, another war crime of Russia, ballistic strike on Sumy, killing of Ukrainian civilians. Many people went to church on Palm Sunday. Some were returning home. He said the attacks were launched from Lysky and Lezhensky. They are in Russia's Voronezh and Kursk oblasts, respectively. The first about 250 kilometres east and the second about 50 kilometres north of Sumy. General Bodanov vowed, quote, to ensure that no war criminal, from those who gave orders to those who launched the missiles, escapes retribution. Francis, what's the international reaction been to the strikes?
Well, thanks, Dom. European leaders were swift to condemn the attack in the strongest possible terms. Just to quote from a few, Ursula von der Leyen, head of the European Commission, Russian cruelty struck again, killing men, women and children. A barbaric attack made even more vile as people gathered peacefully to celebrate Palm Sunday. This latest escalation is a grim reminder. Russia was and remains the aggressor, in blatant violation of international law. Strong measures are urgently needed to enforce a ceasefire. Europe will continue to reach out to partners and maintain strong pressure on Russia until the bloodshed ends and a just and lasting peace is achieved, on Ukraine's terms and conditions. The victims of today's attack, their families and all Ukrainians are in our hearts today and every day. Europe stands with Ukraine and President Zelensky. Kaja Kallas, the EU's top diplomat, echoed that sentiment, saying all those who want the killing to stop should put the maximum pressure. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer added, I'm appalled at Russia's horrific attacks and my thoughts are with the victims and their loved ones at this tragic time. President Zelensky has shown his commitment to peace. Putin must now agree to a full and immediate ceasefire without conditions. President Macron of France said similar. Everyone knows, he said, this war was initiated by Russia alone. And today it is clear that Russia alone chooses to continue it with blatant disregard for human lives, international law and the diplomatic efforts of President Trump. Strong measures are needed to impose a ceasefire on Russia, and France is working tirelessly toward this goal alongside its partners. To the victims, the wounded, and all of Ukraine that continues to resist, our solidarity, our respect, and our unwavering commitment. But soon-to-be German Chancellor Friedrich Merz went further, calling the missile assault a deliberate and calculated war crime. As there were, as you say, Dom, 2 waves of attacks, and the second arrived as emergency workers were taking care of the victims. Poland's leader Donald Tusk wrote simply, "The Russian version of a ceasefire. Bloody Palm Sunday." But it was perhaps the Lithuanian foreign minister who said explicitly what many think in private, that this is a humiliation for Trump's attempt to broker a peace in Ukraine. But what did President Trump himself have to say in response to the attack? That it was a mistake. To quote him directly, "I think it was terrible, and I was told they made a mistake. But I think it's a horrible thing, and I think the whole war is a horrible thing." Now, when asked to clarify what he meant by a mistake, Trump said that they made a mistake. You're going to ask them, without specifying who or what he meant. But the them has to be assumed to be the Russians, I think. Now, if one were being generous, one would say that he's saying this because he does not want to compromise the peace talks. But many are pointing to this as yet further evidence that the president's instinct is always to believe or even support the Russians. Bear in mind that his envoy, Steve Witkoff, was just in Moscow shaking hands with Putin in front of the cameras, a man who said Putin was not a bad guy. He even visited an Orthodox Christian cathedral. Within hours, as we've just heard, churchgoers in Ukraine were being directly targeted. That is something that has rattled the American right. US Senator Lindsey Graham, the joint author of that bipartisan bill seeking to impose sanctions and secondary tariffs against Russia, wrote as follows: "Russia's barbaric Palm Sunday attack on Christian worshippers in Ukraine seems to be Putin's answer to efforts to achieve a ceasefire and peace. Unless there is a dramatic change soon, it is obvious to me that the only hope of ending this war is to continue to cripple Russia's economy and punish those who prop up Putin." At its core, Dom, as many have rightly pointed out, it bears reiterating that Putin's assaults on Ukrainian civilians is driven by his confidence that Trump will stand by him ultimately. As friend of the podcast, Ukrainian journalist Svitlana Morenets of The Spectator wrote in her newsletter last week, "I'm in Ukraine to report on a potential ceasefire, but the nightly explosions outside my window suggest there isn't going to be any time soon. It's been a month since Ukraine agreed to a full unconditional 30-day ceasefire under immense pressure from Trump's administration. Moscow rejected it outright, refusing to agree unless Kyiv stopped conscripting men and military aid from the West was cut off. But there have been no consequences of this decision. No deadlines, no ceasefire. Whatever hope Ukrainians had that the fighting and dying might pause has faded," Svitlana continues. "Russia has launched at least 70 missiles and 2,200 drones at Ukraine since the ceasefire proposal. The country is still mourning the 9 children killed last week. A Russian Iskander missile filled with cluster bombs struck a playground. It sliced through metal swings, shattered windows and tore through bodies. 20 people died in total. The youngest victim was 3 years old. Russia's Ministry of Defense claimed, in typical fashion, that it was a successful strike on a gathering of Ukrainian and foreign military personnel. But there were no soldiers on the playground or in the restaurant nearby, only families. My village lies far to the west and is considered relatively safe. There are no military targets, except for a school or maybe the hospital Russia would consider worth a strike. But the war leaves its mark here too. It arrives in caskets from the front. A family friend, 56, was buried recently. He was killed near Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region, 2 months after being called up. Men his age are sent straight into the infantry, to the trenches. They don't last long. He was given a hero's funeral, with hundreds of people lining the road to the cemetery, throwing flowers as the procession passed. I can only hope his children found some comfort in that, but I don't think they did. Svitlana Morenets there. That is the reality of the war today. And as much as European leaders might criticise the actions of Putin, it seems clear that if their words are to carry weight, it will be on their shoulders to carry the burden of Ukraine's struggle. But more on that shortly, Dom.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. Now, just before I move on with the other news of the day, I'll just offer a comment, if I may, on this strike. So I've been away for a week. It's quite revelatory to take a few days off, and I didn't manage to stop looking at the news and doom scrolling and all the things that we're supposed to switch off and what have you. I didn't manage to achieve that. I'm sorry about that, but I did have some downtime, and so I come back and I'm able to sort of look at this thing with somewhat clearer eyes, I may say. So my week off was bookended by two of the latest egregious Russian strikes. The Kyiv strike on April the 4th, 20 killed, including 9 children, as we've just heard, an attack on the playground, and yesterday's strike in Sumy. In between, we saw Steve Witkoff in Moscow meeting Putin, all the rest of it, all the diplomatic handshaking, in stark contrast to what's actually happening on the ground. Now, Donald Trump says that this attack was a mistake. Even for one moment, just so as painful as it might be, but just hold for one moment. Let's accept that it was a mistake. Is that a defence? The drunk driver that kills 2 kids on his way back from the pub, who says, it was a mistake. Do you let them go? Is there no retribution? Is there no justice for your actions? No consequences for your actions, regardless of whether it's a mistake? Or look at it another way. What if this had been a Ukrainian strike that mistakenly killed 34 Russians, including kids, injured 117? What do you think Donald Trump's response would have been to that? Now, as I said, the attack comes 2 days after Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff met Putin. Russia clearly feels that they can keep doing this as long as they maintain this charade of progress in so-called talks, in efforts to end the war. But I think that by willfully ignoring that, and I think it is willful, Trump is either trying to delude himself, delude us, or do anything to avoid criticising Putin, or all three. Now, none of that is expected of a national, let alone a global leader. Or Trump genuinely thinks these strikes, 9 kids a week ago in Kyiv, 34 killed yesterday, too many others we could mention, if he thinks they are genuinely mistakes, he's an idiot. And he does not deserve to hold the position he's in. So what do you reckon it is, folks? How do you reckon we get where we are today? Anyway, let's cover the rest of today's news. Now, there's been next to no movement on the ground, and as I say, it's been away for a week. It is telling how little has moved. Yes, there's been a little bit of movement in the Donbass mainly, a little bit up in Kursk, although still there, still Ukrainian troops there, nearly 9 months now. But actually, the line has moved next to nowhere. The second biggest army in the world, we are told. There were 1,310 Russian casualties yesterday, according to Ukraine's General Staff, and British MOD said this morning that just this year alone, Russia has racked up 138,000 casualties, killed, injured, missing and taken prisoner. Now, across Ukraine yesterday, at least 40 people were killed and 141 injured, marking one of the deadliest days in recent months. Most of those casualties were accounted for in that Sumy blast. There were 62 Russian drones fired across the country, one of which injured a nurse in Chernihiv Oblast after a clinic was hit. Russian strikes killed 2 civilians in Kupiansk, in Kyiv Oblast, 3 in Kherson, 1 in Donetsk. 7 people were injured in a drone attack on the Black Sea port of Odessa that also damaged several homes and a medical facility last night. Ukrainian authorities reporting that this morning. Now, also this morning, Russia accused Ukraine of carrying out 8 attacks on energy infrastructure in the last 24 hours, although they didn't provide any evidence whatsoever. They, again, said this violates the ceasefire deal. They are still pushing this false line that a ceasefire deal has been agreed. A month, as you said earlier, Francis, a month after Ukraine agreed to the US unconditional ceasefire, which Russia said they would observe as long as certain conditions were first met. The Schrodinger's unconditional ceasefire, as I've called it in the past. Anyway, in the latest attempt to shape the narrative such that the world thinks that Ukraine has violated a deal, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said earlier today the moratorium was essentially not observed by the Ukrainian side. Therefore, of course, these 30 days will need to be analysed. Do not let him shape the narrative, folks. Now, related to that, Poland's Foreign Minister, Radoslaw Sikorski, he said this morning on arrival at a meeting of European Union foreign ministers in Luxembourg that Putin is mocking Donald Trump's goodwill by continuing to step up attacks on Ukraine. He said Ukraine unconditionally agreed to a ceasefire over a month ago. The heinous attacks on Kryvyi and on Sumy is Russia's mocking answer. I hope that President Trump and the US administration see that the leader of Russia is mocking their goodwill, and I hope the right decisions are taken. Okay, the next one for me. Ukraine says it's struggling to recruit young soldiers despite launching a program dedicated to enlisting those aged between the ages of 18 and 24. Pavel Palisa, who's the deputy head of President Zelensky's office, said fewer than 500 contracts had been signed as a result of the program. This was launched in February. Now, under that program, those who sign up would be given an upfront payment of £18,000. That's about $24,000, and then a monthly salary of about, just over 2,200 quid, about $3,000, in addition to a 0% mortgage, free education and healthcare. But asked about why recruitment numbers are so low, Mr. Palisa said, sometimes parents have an influence. Somewhere they thought that peace was about to come and they no longer need to. There are many reasons. We are studying them to draw conclusions. Okay, the Kyiv Independent reporting today that the SBU, the Security Service of Ukraine, has detained an instructor at a training centre in Lviv Oblast in the west of the country, who was planning assassinations of the base's commanders. Now, in a statement this morning, the SBU said the suspect, who was an instructor at the Yavoriv training ground, that's about 10 kilometres from Ukraine's western border with Poland, is accused of simultaneously working for both the Russian FSB, the Federal Security Service, and military intelligence, GRU. Now, Ukraine's SBU said that this individual had explored multiple assassination methods, including planting an improvised explosive device inside the headquarters or training buildings, and covertly using a fellow instructor, unknowingly, to deliver explosives to Ukrainian commanders. The suspect also reportedly considered passing target coordinates to Russia for a missile strike on military personnel undergoing training at the facility. Russian forces, you may remember, attacked the Yavoriv base in March 2022, reportedly killing over 60 soldiers. Investigators also found that this person had established contact with an FSB handler and collected detailed information about the composition and operations of Ukrainian units training at Yavoriv. The SBU said it exposed the plot before any action was taken by the individual, and he has been charged with high treason under martial law. He's currently in pre-trial detention with no option for bail and faces a potential life sentence with confiscation of property, we are told. Now, we referred earlier to that CBS interview that President Zelensky did yesterday. Elsewhere in that interview, he said that Ukraine is ready to purchase 10 US-made Patriot air defense systems for the price of $15 billion. President Zelensky said he had made the offer directly to Donald Trump and had previously raised it with former President Joe Biden's administration. President Zelensky said, I told President Trump very clearly what we can do. But on Friday, Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiha said Russia had launched 70 missiles and 2,200 Shahed-type drones and 6,000 guided aerial bombs in the past 30 days. I think Svitlana referenced that in her letter to us. Okay, so those are the updates. But Francis, there's more happening on the international front. What else have you got for us?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. There are just a few other bits relevant to the ceasefire conversation specifically. Steve Rosenberg of the BBC, in his regular updates on the Russian media, underscores that over there is no hint of compromise in the press. On the prospects for peace in Ukraine, one paper declares Trump is in a hurry, Russia is in no hurry for a deal. Another paper says Putin's demands have barely changed from the ones he issued last June. Now, that's pretty telling if that's what the Russian propaganda machine is saying. Many, of course, seem reluctant to believe that in the West, especially in the United States. And President Zelensky spoke to 60 Minutes over the weekend, as you say, Dom, where he said that Russian narratives are prevailing in the United States. There's enormous influence of Russia's information policy on America. And it was quite striking to see President Trump then attack 60 Minutes, a very distinguished American documentary program, news program really, where he said that it should be stripped of its license. He didn't name Zelensky, but he slammed the segments on the program as fake and the broadcaster CBS as liars. Now it follows another development which concerned many on Friday night, a Times of London exclusive interview with Special Envoy Keith Kellogg, who seemed to suggest that Ukraine could be divided like Berlin after the Second World War, partitioned with a British and French-controlled zone in the west and Russian forces stationed in the east as part of a peace deal to bring the war to an end. A proposal that would require Ukraine to cede control, of course, of its eastern territories, which are currently under Russian control. Now, Envoy Kellogg was quick to challenge the paper, I should say, saying, and I quote, "The Times article misrepresents what I said. I was speaking of a post-ceasefire resiliency force in support of Ukraine's sovereignty. In discussions of partitioning, I was referencing areas or zones of responsibility for an allied force without US troops. I was not referring to a partitioning of Ukraine." So I think, in other words, he's saying that he was only referring to a partition of responsibility in defensive terms rather than a legal partition of the country. But even if that is true, it is quite an extraordinary thing for a senior US official to say that as a favourable proposition, not least because it appears to frame the partition of Germany and Berlin as historic successes rather than a policy which, for right or wrong, doomed millions to a life of bondage under Soviet oppression. Now, some would argue that there was no alternative after the Second World War, but this is an entirely different situation where there are multiple options available, which could see a more favourable outcome for Kyiv, Europe and Western liberal democracies. Russia is not the Soviet Union, as much as it might pretend to be. It's also quite something for this proposal to be put forward when it seemingly involves very little or no American involvement. And I do, if I may, want to keep challenging the beliefs underpinning this American isolationism, if only from a view of US self-interest. So to our American friends, I say this: America did not give birth to liberty. Her statue in New York is that of a woman, not a child, but it helped her grow into the cherished figure she became, lighting other torches, first by example, then by action. For as long as freedom burns in her hand, her land, your land, will be both a beacon and a target. America isolating itself from the world will not keep it safer. You are a standard bearer, and as long as enemies of liberty exist, you are imperiled. It is far wiser to stand with your allies today, I would argue, in their time of need, than to stand alone tomorrow when you too will face the darkness. To quote the great Ukrainian poet Taurus, who ironically I think is echoing Jefferson, "It is a terrible fate to die a slave, but it's far worse to sleep and slumber in freedom." I fear that the certain long-assumed virtues, especially about how decisions are made, have eroded in the American public because the consequences of bad decisions have been reduced. When the consequences of poor choices no longer visibly affect the average citizen, concerns for how decisions are made begin to wither. Military blunders, strategic missteps, what tangible effect have they had on most Americans in recent decades? Very little, one could argue. And if bad decisions bear no striking cost, why bother caring? But history has a way of collecting the bill. The MAGA right often invokes the fall of Rome, a subject I'm also very interested in. Yet they tend to overlook that for a time, the Roman emperor absorbed failure with barely a ripple. Emperors rose and fell. Many made terrible decisions. But Rome's systems and successful culture carried on until slowly they didn't. The true danger of bad decision-making is not in its immediate cost, but in its cumulative weight. Eventually, it's a weight that becomes unbearable. The whole of the West, not just America, the whole of the West, has to relearn why prudence, accountability, and wisdom matter. Because when that dam finally breaks, it breaks for everyone.
Well, thanks, Francis. Now, one country that perhaps is reacting faster than many of the others in the West, or the external supporters for Ukraine, should we put it that way, is Germany under the new soon-to-be Chancellor. James Rothwell, delighted to have you back on the pod, Berlin correspondent. We hear today, James, that Germany is willing to send its Taurus long-range missiles to Ukraine. Friedrich Merz has said that. Now, why is he able to make such an offer now? And is this the start of the real Zeitenwende? Hi, James.
Hello, Dom. Thanks very much for having me back on. This is a significant moment for German politics, and it's an announcement that Mr. Merz is able to make now, basically because he's finally got a coalition deal together and he's about to become the Chancellor. Once he becomes Chancellor, he will not need a motion in the Bundestag to send Taurus missiles to Ukraine. It's actually something that the Chancellor has sole competency on. It's a decision that he can make himself in something called the German Federal Security Council, which is this rather secretive, if you like, Security Council that's chaired by the Chancellor of Germany, which of course will soon be Mr. Friedrich Merz. His predecessor, Olaf Scholz, as long-time listeners of the podcast know, was basically terrified of sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine. He felt that that was an escalation too far, partly because they were capable of striking targets deep inside Russia or even targets in Crimea, but also because Mr. Scholz was generally very scared of escalation. Mr. Merz, so far, emphasis on so far, because this is something he's promised to do, it's not something he's followed through on yet, he seems much more hawkish on Ukraine. He doesn't seem intimidated by nuclear threats in the same way that Mr. Scholz was. And he recognises, and this is a significant point, I think, that the UK and France have already sent long-range cruise missiles to Ukraine. That was one of the reasons that Mr. Scholz tried not to send them. He said, well, you know, there's a difference here. You know, our missiles are slightly longer in range than the British and French ones. You can't compare like for like. That's a distinction that Mr. Merz doesn't seem to see, and that's why I think it's quite likely that this could happen under a Friedrich Merz-led government. The only caveat is what his coalition allies, the SPD, might make of this politically, Dom.
Yeah, it's interesting you say he's in a stronger political position anyway, but instinctively comes from a different place than Olaf Scholz. I mean, do you think it will make any difference? Where's the political heft in Europe at the moment? Does Germany, with just sort of one shift in policy, are they sort of straight back at the top table? Did they ever leave the top table? Or has power kind of moved either to the EU or north and east in Europe in terms of a sovereign state? What would you suggest?
I think that's a really interesting question. For many years, Germany under Mr. Scholz was all about money and perhaps not so much about decisive weaponry. Yes, Germany was incredibly generous in terms of financial support. And yes, of course, it did eventually start sending large quantities of weapons over to Ukraine. But under Chancellor Scholz, it never sent the Taurus missile system. Scholz felt that it was too much, too fast. He was worried about the retaliation by Putin. And Mr. Merz's announcement, his confirmation of an earlier election pledge that he's ready to send the Taurus missile system, which is long range, which is very powerful, which could in theory blow up the Kremlin in Moscow, that is, I think, a moment of decisive European leadership from Friedrich Merz. It's an early sign, I think, that he's willing to follow through on this idea of what he's called a new European defence community, a community of independent European nations which make their own strategic decisions on how they will stand up for the defence of Europe. Remember, something that Mr. Scholz, his predecessor, used to talk about a lot was the lockstep principle, the idea that we won't do X or Y unless the Americans do it first. Mr. Merz is signalling that he wants to go first, that he wants to take the lead. He spoke about getting ahead in the conflict in the interview, which is the source of this story about Taurus missiles. It's definitely Germany sending a signal that it wants to play a bigger role in defence. It comes after lots of reforms on defence that we've talked about previously on the podcast. The only slight caveat I'd add is that in the same interview where Mr. Merz said he was willing to send Taurus missiles, he put a lot of emphasis on requiring agreement from the British and the French. He said that this move must be jointly agreed, and I quote, if it's agreed, then Germany should take part. It's puzzled some people in Germany why Mr. Merz felt the need to stress that point in the interview. The British have already sent long-range missiles. The French have already sent long-range missiles. We can reasonably state that the UK and France, at least during the Scholz government, obviously, were in favour of Taurus missiles being sent as well. There were many in the UK and French governments who were frustrated with Olaf Scholz for not sending those missiles. So why would it be an issue this time? Why even bring the possibility of the British and the French not agreeing to it up into the conversation? And there's a little bit of a question mark over that. But nevertheless, it's a very positive development, and it does indeed seem incredibly likely that UK and France will be in favour of Germany sending Taurus missiles. And so I think we can reasonably expect that this is going to happen, Dom.
Yeah, I'm on the edge of my long-range missile jigsaw here, James. But I think, as well as the range, I think the issue with Taurus over the French Scalp and the British Storm Shadow is that it's got a dual tandem, or it's got a tandem warhead. So basically, the first warhead can blast something out of the way, harden aircraft shelter, and the second warhead can then smash up the thing inside. Whereas I think Scalp and Storm Shadow just have one massive unitary warhead, i.e. one big blast. And why that is important is because I've been told that the Kerch Bridge would survive a strike by Storm Shadow and Scalp, unless it was in a very, very specific point. But with Taurus, I'm told it would be able to get through the roadway and get onto the actual supporting infrastructure underneath, which would bring down, a good section of the Kerch Bridge. Folks, if you know more about that technically than me, and the chances are you do, please do let me know. But I think that was why Taurus is particularly sensitive. So interesting that Merz talks about the British and the French, obviously right into the ball game of Scalp and Storm Shadow. But I think he's looking for a kind of overt political statement, because if that's why the Kerch Bridge is still standing and Taurus might make a difference there, I think Friedrich Merz, despite his much more forthright language than Olaf Scholz, is looking for just a little bit more political support, which I'm pretty sure he would get. But I think that might be the issue. But James, a couple more for you. You're absolutely right about Germany is now a very large supplier of weapons to Ukraine. It's actually the second largest supplier of military to Ukraine after the United States. Although, well, two things. Firstly, is that going particularly well? I note this story about Germany's Leopard 2 tanks said to be not failing on the battlefield, but there's been some issues there. A leaked report from the diplomatic and military circles in Germany. If you could talk to us about that, please. And you've written about a drone wall along NATO's eastern border that Germany is seeking to build. So could you give us talk a little bit more about some of those developments?
Yes, that's right. So the first story you allude to has come out of the German press, and it's a leak, basically, which suggests that Germany's Leopard 2 tanks are having difficulty, shall we say, on the battlefield in Ukraine. 18 of the Bundeswehr, that's the German army's mainstay, Leopard 2 tanks made their way into Ukraine in 2023, which, as we report in the Telegraph today, follows months of foot dragging by Chancellor Olaf Scholz. But Ukrainian soldiers, we report, citing this article in the German media, Ukrainian soldiers are finding that there are limited capacities and there are shortfalls and there are issues with the tanks. I'll give you a couple of examples of what's going wrong with the Leopard 2s, according to this report in the German media. Its complicated design makes it difficult to repair on the battlefield, and that's apparently exacerbated by the fact that there already aren't that many over in Ukraine being used. It also means that Leopards which get damaged have to be sent to specialised repair crews in western Ukraine, costly, time-consuming, and even in some cases going all the way to Poland for repairs. And some of the technical shortcomings with the Leopard 2 have reportedly led to Ukrainian battalions using them as glorified artillery. Now, I think it's worth stressing here that we are talking about sensitive information about the performance of the Leopard 2 in Ukraine, which someone, presumably in the German government or perhaps elsewhere, has decided to leak to the German press. And I think the timing of this, Dom, is quite interesting because the Scholz government is leaving office very soon. They were so reluctant to send these tanks over in the first place, and purely speculation from my part, of course. But the fact that an article has been published in the German media sort of supporting the argument that, well, perhaps we shouldn't have sent these tanks anyway because they've run into difficulties. That's the argument that seems to be getting put forward, at least. It's an interesting coincidence in terms of the timing, with the Scholz government getting ready to leave power and, of course, perhaps wanting to have the final say, if you like, on some aspects of defence policy where it felt compelled to do something that it didn't necessarily want to do. My speculation, but definitely part of the discussion over here in Berlin about these supposed shortcomings of the tanks. I'm sure all weapons do nonetheless have shortcomings to them. Finally, Dom, I'll just talk briefly about the drone wall. German defence industry firms are getting very excited about this idea. This is the concept of a drone wall, sometimes also known as a drone nexus, that would be built along all or parts of NATO's eastern flank, the Russian border basically, to help defend Western allies from a future invasion. We're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of drones being stationed on that border as an early detection system, as a form of deterrence, as a system which some German defence industry experts say could actually replace minefields, potentially. This is a story I wrote over the weekend. I spoke to one German drone provider, Quantum Systems, which already has a fleet of battle-hardened, if you like, drones that are being deployed in Ukraine. They're very keen to contribute to this idea. They say with the right political coordination, a drone wall could be ready within a year. So it's something that's being put together potentially by the Germans if they get a lucrative contract very quickly. This, of course, follows reforms by the incoming Merz government, which unlocks potentially unlimited defence funding in Germany. That's obviously part of the picture. But it also follows various assessments by EU leaders, NATO leaders over the past year, who are estimating that the eastern flank of NATO could be the scene of the next major confrontation with Russia. And so this story is also feeding into those concerns about what could happen on that eastern flank in the near future.
The troubles in Northern Ireland are raging. Civilians find themselves caught in the crosshairs.
My father was covered in blood.
Behind the violence, there's a sinister secret.
He is probably the most high-profile British agent that we know of to date.
A covert unit of the British Army is connected to a string of murders.
If you could recruit a terrorist, that's the cream on the cake.
And the fight for justice continues.
There wasn't just one agent. Most of them were agents.
The latest podcast from The Telegraph. I'm Cara McGugan, and this is Bed of Lies. Search Bed of Lies wherever you're listening to this.
Well, thanks, James. Come back to you shortly for final thoughts. You say Olaf Scholz likes to have the final say. Well, let's go on to our final thoughts now. And it's a couple from me, please, before we go to James. So why this strike? Why this strike on Sumy and Kyiv and others? And is Russia now going to think, oh, actually, we shouldn't really be doing this? Let's take the heat off. I don't think they will, folks. I think they're going to keep going. Not only because I think they sense tacit, not support, I really can't go there, but tacit acceptance by the US administration. As long as they keep up the noises about wanting to have ceasefire talks and negotiations and all that kind of stuff, then I think they will sense that they have a bit of license to carry on doing what they want on the battlefield. Why might they be doing that? Because it's not having any tactical significance whatsoever. Early May. Keep your eye on the calendar for early May. I think it's the 8th, something like that. But that's when the current permissions that President Zelensky has under martial law runs out. Each year, the Ukrainian parliament votes for martial law. It lasts a year, and it gets voted in again. Generally seen to be a bit of an easy vote, but by no means a given. And of course, you can't have presidential elections under martial law. So the next time that this bill for martial law to be extended is in early May. Now, a lot of the Russian narrative at the moment is about President Zelensky being illegitimate as a leader. He hasn't had a presidential vote for years, etc., etc. It's all guff, of course, as if they can lecture the world about what legitimate, free and fair and transparent elections are all about. But the reason it hasn't been is because there's martial law imposed, because there's a goddamn war on. Right now, President Zelensky, I see from a number of places, seems to be possibly coming round to the idea of having presidential elections. That would play well with Donald Trump. It would absolutely spike the guns of Putin and his argument about illegitimacy. And one of the reasons I'm told he might be coming around to that idea, very strong emphasis on might, is since that, the Oval Office meltdown, President Zelensky's popularity ratings have soared inside the country, inside Ukraine. So if there was any presidential vote today, the chances are President Zelensky would walk it. Now, Putin, as I say, this narrative about his illegitimacy has kind of gone a bit cool in the last few weeks, since the Oval Office meltdown, really. Perhaps Putin now doesn't want elections in Ukraine, as it would solidify Zelensky's position. And therefore, I think Russia, if that is playing into their calculus in any way, I think they would want to ramp up these murderous and egregious strikes in order to quash any possible domestic pressure for elections inside Ukraine. So the more of these strikes, the less likely it is that come May the 8th, I think it is the 8th, that Ukraine will say, actually, let's cancel martial law. That's just my theory, putting together a few bits and pieces that I've seen around the bazaars. But as ever, be interested in your thoughts there. My second final thought, if you can have two final thoughts, thank you to Jason. It's written to us from the US, and as we always say, we do read every email. Jason, thanks for writing in. Jason, you say you've got a friend who's just signed up for Ukraine's International Brigade, and you are concerned for this individual. You are keen to hear from International Brigade members about their experiences, especially what kit they took and what kit they needed that wasn't available on issue on arrival. Now, it's been a little while since we talked about the International Brigade, and we've never done a deep dive, actually. We should do. But folks, if you have recent experience, if you're in the International Brigade, please do let us know what we can pass on to Jason and his friend. It'd be obviously in complete confidence, but very interested in your experiences and any recommendations. As Jason says, and this is a quote from his email, "You may be helping me save this heroic lunkhead's life." So folks, do let us know if you are in or have close experience of the International Brigade. That's enough from me. James, what are your final thoughts, please?
Thanks, Dom. I think it's a really interesting point that you made earlier about the subtle difference between the Taurus and the French and British equivalents of Taurus, namely that the Taurus could actually do way, way, way more damage to the Kerch Bridge, and that might be a significant difference that perhaps might cause some jitters in Germany in terms of sending it to Ukraine because of that greater risk of escalation. And I think, and this is my final thought, basically, that's why it will be very interesting to see what the reaction out of the UK and France will be to Mr. Merz's interview, where he's kind of left the door open to them possibly vetoing Taurus deliveries at this juncture of the war because of their greater power. So I think let's see what the message is coming out of the UK and France. If, as we expect, they will say, "Oh no, Mr. Incoming Chancellor, that's a great idea, let's push on with it," then Germany, I guess, is going to have to send those missiles, and that will be a significant moment in the war and basically a bit of a catastrophe for Vladimir Putin. So let's see what happens.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Knowles.